Hello everyone. Welcome to Loving Out Loud, the video series. You've reached chapter 6. The title of this chapter is Jimmy, Bumblebees, and Forgiveness. I hope you get some insight from this story, or actually there's a couple of stories here, but I hope you get some insight that will help you in your own world. One of these stories dogged me for a very long time, so I hope the way that I ended up being able to deal with it provides you some insight for your own life. Our theme scriptures for this week, actually there's several, it's a little bit longer this time. The first one comes from Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 to 45, where Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said, 'Love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven." Jesus also said in Matthew chapter 6, verses 14 and 15, he said, "For if you forgive other people when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their sins, your Father will not forgive you your sins." In 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 8, it says, "Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers a multitude of sins." I want you to hang on to that one because we're going to come back to that particular verse. And then Luke 23, 33 to 34 says, "When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there along with the criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. Jesus said, 'Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing.'" Now, when I went to Bible college, that was 1980, 81, 82 time frame. I was 2 years at Bible college, and then I came back to my home church and got involved with the young professional and college age group at my home congregation. And I'm going to tell you a little story that happened it was during that period of time. So it was probably sometime around 1983. I was sitting in a devotional. It was being led by one of the college students from Ball State University. This person was just a student at Ball State. He was not a Bible scholar. He wasn't a Bible student. He was just another college kid, a leader in the college group, but he was not formally trained in any particular way. And I was fresh out of 2 years of Bible college, and I had actually studied New Testament Greek while I was in college. The picture there that you see of the book, that's actually my Greek textbook from my days at Bible college. I had a couple of semesters. Now, really, let's be honest. Koine Greek, which is the type of Greek that the New Testament was written in, isn't really spoken today, and it's 2,000 years old, and 2 semesters is not enough for me to become fluent in that old language. It's about enough to help me work through a word study if I have the right kind of reference materials. But I'd had 2 semesters of New Testament Greek, and this other guy had 0 semesters of New Testament Greek. But we're sitting in this devotional, and I don't remember the whole topic of the devotional. I have no clue. But at one point in time, he made the point to the other guys in the devotional. He says there's 3 Greek words that are translated into the word love, of which I immediately said, no, actually there's 4. There's 4 Greek words. And he just glared at me. He glared at me and he disregarded me and he blew me off and he didn't respect anything about my training. And actually he insulted me and I got really angry about that. I was angry, I was hurt, I was mad, And something happened right there. A grudge moved into my heart. A grudge moved in. It moved into the spare bedroom of my heart. And the thing is that um, it took me a while to work through that. Eventually, though, I figured out that I actually started it. There were two of us talking about love, but neither of us were displaying it. Yeah, he may have disregarded me and embarrassed me, but at the same time, I embarrassed him. I contradicted him in front of the other guys, and it would have been better if I had just approached him afterwards and we just had a conversation about it, because I didn't have anything to prove. Why did I need to do that to him? But bottom line is, a grudge moved in. And it wasn't until I sort of had some compassion over the situation that I was able to deal with it. I want to ask you a question as we move into the next story. Why is it that we can remember slights so easily? Insults, things where people mistreated us a little bit. Why can we remember those so easily, even across decades? But on the other hand, it's often quite difficult to remember the nice things that people do for us. So give that some thought. Now I'll tell you about Jimmy. This is the heart of the story this particular week. On the right there, you can see a picture of me in 8th grade. The story that I'm going to tell you happened to me in the second semester of my 8th grade year. This would have been summer or springtime late winter, springtime of 1976. And as you can see, I was a little bit pudgy. I was a little overweight. I kind of reflect that again now these days. I was awkward, kind of a socially awkward kid. And frankly, I was a coward. I was afraid. I was afraid to stand up for myself. I was afraid of conflicts. I was afraid of fights. I was afraid of a lot of things. So that's who I was in 1976. And Jimmy was a guy, we're going to call him Jimmy. Jimmy was a guy that I knew from elementary school. I'd actually had classes with him probably 5, 6 years earlier back in my elementary school. And the thing that I remember about Jimmy is that he had a very short fuse, that he was a bit of a bully, and that he was not in the least afraid to get into a fight and hurt somebody. So in 8th grade, I'm sitting in math class, and I'm in the back of the class. And we get a new kid in class. And the kid walks in. I hadn't seen Jimmy in 4 or 5 years. And there he was. He was back in my school. He was in my math class. And for some reason, after the teacher seated him, the teacher moved me right up from the back of the class to the front of the class to sit right next to Jimmy. And at first I was okay with that because I hadn't seen him in a long time, and I thought maybe, things were different. But I soon found out that wasn't the case. Jimmy, within minutes, began to mess with me. He began to bully me. He began to pick at me. Through something in that process, I don't know where he got it, and this is where the title Bumblebees and Forgiveness comes from, but he had a little synthetic bumblebee on a rubber band, and he began to flick me with it. And here's the thing, you may kind of think it's a little funny, but it wasn't funny to me at the time. But sitting 6 feet in front of me is the teacher, and somehow he missed this whole thing. But Jimmy would every day flick me with that bumblebee, daring me to do something about it, daring me to stand up for myself, calling me names, picking at me, flicking at me, making everybody laugh at me, humiliating me. Guys, it was torture. I dreaded going to school every day. I dreaded that class. I was in turmoil. I wanted to turn around and punch him in the nose, but I was afraid. I was afraid to do it. It might have saved us all a whole lot of heartache if I had just stood up for myself, but I didn't. I was in turmoil. I'm going to pause here for a second because there might be somebody who watches this who is in a similar situation. I want to tell you two things. Number one, don't be like me. Don't be afraid to get some help. I never told the teacher who was sitting in front of me. I never told anyone. I just suffered through it. Don't be afraid to get some help. And number two, it will change. Don't give in to the temptation to despair. It will change. Time changes everything, and it changed that. But at the time, I was in turmoil through the whole semester. I couldn't wait for that school year to end so that I could get away from Jimmy. And ultimately it did. The school year ended. My years at middle school ended, and I went off to high school, and I didn't have to deal with Jimmy anymore, except the grudge moved in to the spare bedroom and took up residence, and I couldn't get rid of it. As a Christian, I knew that I needed to forgive Jimmy. I knew I needed to let it go. But the fact is every time it would come back to my memory, every time it would come back to me, that turmoil, that pain, that trauma would come back, and I would be angry, and I would be wishing that I could punch Jimmy in the nose. But I just couldn't seem to break the cycle. That grudge lived in my heart. Now, in my career, in my job, I travel around. I used to do it a lot more traveling than I do now. I had a territory and I'd visit different cities, and my hometown was one of them. And often I would go to Max Hamburgers on Madison Street. And I didn't get a hamburger there. I always got their ham and cheese. I love their ham and cheese sandwiches. But when I would travel in town, and very often I would eat lunch by myself, and I often went to Max. And the reason wasn't the great food, although I did love their ham and cheese, but I also kind of hoped maybe I'd run into somebody that I knew. You know, you kind of go back to your hometown, and you kind of hope that you run into somebody. And gosh, there might have been people that I saw and I didn't recognize because we change over time. But one day I was sitting in Max, and I would travel there on business. I was in my 40s. So, here we are 25 years later, 30 years later, probably 30 years later. I'm sitting in Mac's restaurant and I'm having my ham and cheese. And on an opposite table facing me is a familiar face. I can't place the face, but it's familiar. And we're close enough we can talk, and we acknowledge each other. And I said, "Hey, you look really familiar." And he looks back at me and he smiles and he goes, "I'm Jimmy." And immediately the grudge resurfaced. Now I'm going to pause right here, and I want to reread a couple of passages, and I want you to think about these as I tell you the rest of the story. Luke 23 says, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing." And 1 Peter 4:8, "Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers a multitude of sins." So immediately I see Jimmy, and he tells me who he is, and immediately I'm back in 8th grade. I'm I'm in my, it's 30 years later now, and I'm balding and probably turning gray at that point, and yet I'm sitting there still back in 8th grade because that's the Jimmy I remember. And he acted like we were old friends. He seemed pleased to see me. He was like we were buddies or something. But then as we talked, he began to tell me about his life and about the struggles. We all face struggles. We all have difficulties. He had faced difficulties in his life, and he shared them with me. He shared the stories. He shared with me the pain. He shared with me the mistakes. He shared with me the struggles. Um, he told me about that. And he also told me about how he had found God and that he was trying to clean up his life. He was trying to get it right. He was trying to make amends. He was trying to live the way that God would have him live. And I thought that was all great, but I still had that grudge. The grudge was still sitting in there. So I looked at him and I said, you know, you were pretty hard on me back in school. I wasn't mad when I said it. I just felt like I needed to say it. It just felt like it needed to be said. And I didn't know how he would react. We were having a reasonable conversation, but I didn't know how he'd react to that. But I just felt like I needed to say it. He looked at me, very serious. And he looked me in the eye and he said, "I'm really sorry about that. I'm really sorry about that." And you know, when he did that, the grudge moved out. I was able to let it go. I was able to forgive it. I was able to put it behind me. I was able to move out of 8th grade. Um, and that's all I needed. But why did that work? Why did that suddenly wipe it away? And I think it was because I suddenly felt some compassion for him. He had told me about his life. He told me about what was going on. And my grudge was replaced by compassion. My compassion overruled my bitterness, and the grudge was forced out. You know, the Bible says the most important commandment is to love one another, or to love God, and the second is to love your neighbor. But I think the hardest command is the command to forgive. When Jesus, the passages that we shared at the beginning about, if we forgive, God will forgive us. I think those are some of the hardest passages to fulfill. But I want you to think about the crucifixion. Jesus forgave his crucifiers while they were still crucifying him. It didn't take him 3 decades like it did with me to forgive Jimmy. He was able to forgive the people who were crucifying while they were in the middle of doing it. And the reason is because of love. He loved us so much, he was willing to suffer. But not just us in general, the people who were actually doing the crucifying. He loved them too. And he asked God to forgive them because they didn't know what they were doing. His compassion would not allow him to be hateful and angry and bitter and carry a grudge towards those people. Love and grudges cannot live in the same house. Point to take home with you. Love and grudges cannot live in the same house. All right. That's a lot of story, huh? Here's your discussion questions for this week. You know the drill. Pause it after each question, discuss it. Kick it around. If it's just you, still pause it and think about it. Maybe write down a note. Number 1, is it easier for you to remember old hurts or old blessings? Why do you think that is? Second, can you share about an old grudge that you've struggled to deal with? My guess is you can, because most of us have them. They only hurt us. They don't hurt the people that we're having grudges against. They only hurt us, but we still have them. Can you share about an old grudge that you've struggled to deal with? Number 3, how can compassion overcome grudges in our lives? How can compassion overcome grudges in our lives? The next one is, why is it that love and grudges, why is it they can't coexist? What is it about that? And then lastly, do you find Christ's willingness to immediately forgive his crucifiers personally challenging? I know I do. I definitely do. It, to me, is one of the most challenging things to try to be a Christian and to imitate his willingness to forgive. And now it's time for your weekly challenge. Are you ready for this one? This one might be tough. This one might be the toughest one you've had so far. Try to track down someone for whom you're carrying a grudge and attempt to heal that wound through compassion. Basically, try to find a way to let love cover a multitude of sins. Remember that passage? Love each other deeply because love covers a multitude of sins. When we begin to find a way to have compassion or love for people whom we struggle with, we can no longer carry a grudge. So track down someone whom you're carrying a grudge for and attempt to heal that wound by having compassion for them. All right, that's enough challenge for 1 week. Next week, we get to talk about the cart kid. The cart kid, and it's more fun to forgive. All right, look forward to that one, huh? I'll see you all next week.